In Canada, the LGBT movement uses pride flags to bully small towns and small communities across the country. And a great example of this, unfortunately, is an article released on the CBC, that's Canada's national broadcaster, for those of you fortunate enough never to have encountered it, on November 22. The headline says it all, and I'm actually going to read through this article because it is really a masterclass in propaganda. The title is Ontario Human Rights Tribunal Fines Emo Township for Refusing Pride Proclamation. Here's what the article says. The Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, this is sort of a pseudo-judicial kangaroo court that has given far too much power, has found the township of Emo will have to pay damages after refusing to proclaim Pride Month back in 2020. Borderland Pride, I do like the name, requested Emo to declare June as a Pride Month and display a rainbow flag for 1 week, but the township refused, resulting in a years-long process in which the tribunal ruled against the township. So keep in mind here that this means LGBT activists are suing a town because that town refuses to use public property to declare allegiance to their particular ideology. That's what's going on here, because LGBT activists, by the way, think they own your public spaces, and colonizers always use flags to symbolize their dominance over territory. And the LGBT movement in Trudeau's Canada now more or less owns the country. That's why we have a 4-month Pride season in Trudeau's Canada. And so now what they're saying is we have the right to raise our flag here, and if you do not, we're going to sue you. And that lawsuit has worked. The tribunal ruled Borderland Pride will be awarded $15,000, with $10,000 coming from the township itself, and another $5,000, get this, coming from Emo Mayor, that didn't sound great, but Emo is the township, Emo Mayor Harold McQuaker. So Harold McQuaker's got to pay $5,000 to the LGBT activists because he refuses to raise a flag symbolizing his allegiance to their ideology, which, by the way, is an ideology that includes furries and half-naked men scampering around downtown in Canada's largest cities every June, and includes unfettered support for sex changes for minors, just to give you an idea of what this flag means in 2024. Doug Johnson is a lawyer in Fort Frances and one of the directors on the board of Borderland Pride, and said they're elated to have finally brought it to a close, and it is a significant victory for the organization. And there's a picture of him here on the CBC looking precisely as you'd expect somebody like him to look. We didn't pursue this because of the money. We pursued this because we were treated in a discriminatory fashion by a municipal government, and municipalities have obligations under the Ontario Human Rights Code not to discriminate in the provision of a service, said Judson cluelessly. The tribunal's decision affirms that. That is the important thing we were seeking here, was validation that the 2S LGBTQA plus people, I never know what the plus stands for, and I'm not looking forward to finding out, we're entitled to a treatment without discrimination when we try to seek services from our local government. I don't know what he means by services, but flying a flag that affirms all of these identities and whatever the plus people are is not a service. In addition to the compensation, the tribunal also ordered McQuaker and the chief administrative officer of the municipality to complete a Human Rights 101 training course offered by the Ontario Human Rights Commission within 30 days. So they all had to go to re-education camp to find out why the LGBT and the plus people were actually deserving of having a flag fly over a town inhabited by people who are not part of the alphabet mafia. Judson said one of the messages it sends to other townships and municipalities is that pride needs to be in the smallest and remote communities, just as it is in larger cities, and in some of the places where it can be really hard to help people understand why it's so important. So in other words, we want to fly our flag in your town so you realize that we own this place too. It's a nice little town you have there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. We see this happening at towns right across the country. I hope that it emboldens and strengthens people in communities like Emo and other places like that across Ontario to know they have entitlements from their government, said Judson. He is really insufferable. Going forward, Judson said he would like to see the relationship between Borderland Pride, which is kind of like a forced coercive marriage, and the township of Emo be more positive after re-education is complete, with the municipality being a more active supporter of their programming. Otherwise, he'll probably go back to court. Having a place like Emo as part of Pride and having leadership figures take part in Pride, it lends a lot of support to the movement, whether you like it or not. It validates and legitimizes that the message is important for the entire community, so we hope that is the case moving forward. CBC News reached out to the mayor of Emo for comment, but did not receive a response. He was probably boning up on Human Rights 101 and discovering that this means he now has to support the plus people, as well as sex changes for kids, and also those weird drag queens who show up in downtown Toronto with their derriere hanging out in public. And if you don't believe me, Google Toronto Pride, hit Google Images, and make sure your kids aren't in the room, because I'm not exaggerating. So this is really extraordinary, because it's a microcosm again of what's going on across the country. We've seen this in multiple small towns all the way across. Generally speaking, big cities have had pride parades, but small towns don't. And so what Pride has been doing is they've been setting up these small pride organizations in little towns, and they've been trying to force pride parades into these towns for the sheer purpose of normalizing and mainstreaming their worldview. And they're doing it especially where they know the majority of people don't agree with them, because they want to rub people's faces in it. That's why you've got to have, a pride sidewalk in every single small town. And if there ends up being rubber on the sidewalk because, cars drive over them and there is rubber on tires, this can be declared a hate crime and suddenly they're victims. And so most Canadian institutions at the national level always are competing to see who can grovel lowest and flag wave the hardest. And politicians generally arrive to genuflect their cultural overlords, and corporations send big expensive floats to these festivals of nudity and indecency, and the LGBT flag is hoisted everywhere. My local grocery store still has giant progress flags pasted to the automatic sliding glass doors, and I'm pretty sure Pride season ended several months ago, although it may be longer now. So who knows? Maybe November now is also part of Pride season, because pretty soon they're going to own the whole calendar. So here's how this grift works, because what LGBT activists do is they move into somewhere and they insist that everybody fly the LGBT flag to overtly announce support for their ideology. And what happens next is some institutions decline to fly this flag for reasons ranging from just religious disagreement in general, or community unity. Communities are made up of all kinds of different groups, and generally speaking, most communities only want to fly flags that everybody can agree with. So you've seen a number of bylaws passed in Alberta and Ontario where cities said we're actually going to limit the flags on civic flagpoles to the township, the province, or the country, because these are flags that unify everyone from a conservative Christian to an LGBT activist. But then what happens is point 3. LGBT activists characterize this refusal to proactively show support for their agenda as a backlash, and then the Canadian media obediently characterizes it as such. LGBT activists now, of course, are the victims or the targets because of their own targets' refusal to participate in the narrative that they themselves have created. And it's really sickening to watch this take place. We actually saw this in the small town of Norwich, Ontario, some years ago, where the town council voted to limit the flags flown on civic flagpoles to federal, provincial, or township flags. The LGBT activists, they hosted these major protests. They attempted to take over city council. That didn't work. And then they actually had topless activists protesting outside a church all summer. So first it was 1, then it ended up being around 3 women. Again, they were completely topless in front of church where thousands of people were driving past every Sunday morning. And they were essentially weaponizing nudity and aiming it at families with small children. But of course, this is just portrayed as, a civil rights protest on behalf of the LGBT movement, not weaponizing nudity and aiming it at kids, which it very explicitly is, which is in keeping with the way the LGBT movement functions. But let me give you a quote just to show you how this works. Tammy Murray, the president of Oxford County Pride, stated that, "I think our safety is at risk in Norwich and Ontario." And I think that was demonstrated last evening when they passed the flagpole ban, not just by banning pride flags, but they also did not endorse the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and they also refused to proclaim Pride Month. All of the above is very concerning in terms of their understanding of oppression and marginalization. This is actually a joke. And it's very easy to see how the game is played. Again, let me just lay this out for people, because there's a lot of people who are like, well, how did we get here? How did we go from being a small rural town, and suddenly we've got a pride crosswalk, and if somebody squeals their tires going around a corner, this is immediately a hate crime, because apparently LGBT activists aren't aware that people drive across sidewalks and across crosswalks, and that when they do so, sometimes you get black marks on the road, which you usually can't see because it's black asphalt, but you can see it on a bright rainbow crosswalk because it's really, really obvious and, kind of gauche and irritating. But so sometimes it shows up there, and this is not a hate crime. It's what happens when people drive on the road. So this might be helpful information to those who feel persecuted but don't actually need to, so they can hug this information to themselves and recognize that nobody actually cares at all. But the reality is that the reason they're doing this in these small towns is because they create the whole narrative ahead of time. Hey, do this. The person's like, I'm not going to do that. He's like, I can't believe the backlash to my very honest and innocent request. And so by you saying no to a demand, you are creating a backlash. They then immediately called the CBC and Global and City News. When this went down in Norwich, Ontario, there was over 40 mainstream media articles that portrayed the LGBT communities as victims. Victims of what? Victims of not having a whole month declared just to talk about them and to talk about how great they are and how we agree with all of their behavior, because apparently in Trudeau's Canada in 2024, it's now mandatory to pretend that we agree with these people. Or if you're unfortunate enough to be in Emo Township, you have to personally pay them money because you wouldn't fly their flag and then personally get re-educated. This is one of the reasons you're starting to see a backlash to the LGBT movement in general. And one of the reasons you're starting to see this backlash is because people are just sick of it. They're sick of being told that this is actually no longer about living and let live. This is no longer about tolerance. It's about you need to proactively genuflect to a specific ideology, or you get accused of being hateful, you get accused of being discriminatory, you get told that you need re-education. And so we're finally starting to see a few conservative politicians come out and say what they should have been saying for many years. So John Rustad in BC, for example, I think I pronounced his name right. Anyways, he's the leader of the Conservative Party that made a very good showing in the last provincial election. He responded to a tweet from J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling, of course, has been on fire in her condemnations of gender ideology. But he quoted one of her tweets and said, "In British Columbia, grown men should not be allowed to shower with 10-year-old girls in the change room of a local public pool. This should not be a controversial statement. Frankly, it's unsettling that people are defending this creepy behavior." So one, amen to that. I'm glad John Rustad had the courage to say this. But I do want to make one point here. If you want to have any idea of why this got so far, it's because it took conservatives 10 years to get the testicular fortitude to say this sort of thing in public. I have been saying this for a very long time. So have other activists. And while you have politicians, just like John Rustad, guys like him, right, just sort of middle of the road conservatives who kind of release a statement for Pride Month most of the time, assure everybody they're on board with everything. They stayed silent while all of these changes were made to our culture and to our country. They kept their mouths shut while the transgender movement rolled through all of our institutions. They didn't say a word when conservative MPs and conservative legislators in the provinces started showing up at Pride events. And then so when they finally realized, oh wow, they want us to castrate kids, we should probably say something now. Now it looks like it takes courage. But for years, while I've been watching candidates on the provincial and the federal level get disqualified or kicked out of nominations for saying exactly what John Rustad just said here. There was people who got disqualified in the last election in BC who were running because they said things like this, because they said Pride is gross and people are showing their genitals to kids at Pride, and that's wrong, right? That is, as John Rustad says here now, should not be a controversial statement. Well, it was controversial enough to have people get kicked out of the Conservative Party of British Columbia last time around. So I'm really glad he's saying this, and I don't want to undermine how good it is that he's willing to say this out loud. But if conservatives are going to look at the mayor of Emo having to get re-education and pay $5,000 to the Pride activists, and if you're looking at small towns getting bullied into raising Pride flags, and you're wondering how we got to a place where it's more controversial not to fly the trans flag over a Catholic school in Ontario than it is to fly one, I think conservatives need to take a good, long, hard look in the mirror and realize that they've been appeasing these people for far too long. And as Winston Churchill said, appeasement is the art of feeding a hungry crocodile and hoping he eats you last. And now they've been finally backed into a corner and realized this stuff is insane and we should start to say something about it. Yeah, better late than never. But I do want everybody to recognize that at the end of the day, if people like John Rustad were saying exactly what he just said on November 24, if they were saying this 10 years ago, we wouldn't be where we are now. So let's not make the same mistakes going forward. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and we really appreciate you tuning into the show. If you have any comments on any of the commentary, please drop them in the comment section. If you have suggested topics you'd like to see us cover, again, make those suggestions below. If you found the video helpful, do like it and share it around, because we're trying to build an audience, especially for Canadian socially conservative content. You can also find our podcast wherever you get your content, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we have written commentary, and you can get copies of all of our books, including my new book, which you can see right behind me there. Thanks so much.